The Church of England is already looking for its next Archbishop of Canterbury, and the Catholic Church seems, how can I put it delicately, likely to be looking for a new pontiff within the next year. I have no ill feeling towards the Pope, and I hope he lives to a very old age, but he seems to be pretty ill, and frankly I don't believe the stories the Vatican's putting out. On the 1 minute he's on a mechanical ventilator with double pneumonia, yet at the same time they say he's working and eating breakfast. Anyone who's seen someone on a mechanical ventilator knows that they're unlikely to be eating breakfast in the way that you think of eating breakfast. It's always hard to tell how ill someone is when all you have is the words stable and critical, because they can mean many different things, and often they mean it's none of your business. Let them get on with it. But both men, for me, are united by one characteristic. They are very modern leaders of their church. They're very cool and easygoing and open to everything. They're anti-traditionalist. Leading a church is a balance between tradition and reality. You have traditions about what you do, what you believe, and you have the modern world pushing back on the other side of the scales. The role of a leader of a church is to navigate these choppy seas. And it's not an easy task. Faith is based on belief in fairly absolute truths. When those truths change, they weren't absolute anymore. Now, both churches face a bit of a crisis. Go to many churches in Britain on a Sunday, and they are quite quiet. You won't be struggling to find a pew unless they have a really good school. And then the pews will be full, not with true believers, but with people who want their kids to go to a good school. I had an Irish friend who I was pretty sure was at best agnostic. I sort of assumed he was an atheist. And then he made reference to going to Mass on a Sunday. And I picked up on it, and I questioned him, and yes, he went to Church of England. I said, I didn't know you were Church of England. I've always assumed you were Catholic. Well, I am, he said, but to get our son into the school, I have to go every other week. So he goes every second week to a church which he wasn't baptised in, to follow a religion he doesn't believe, so that he can do the best for his son. Churches are an expensive business to run, and there has to be a degree of pragmatism. I'm sure that plenty of priests know that some of their attendees don't really believe a minute of it, and are grateful that they're in attendance and hopeful that they can get through to them with their beliefs during the course of that school qualification process. But not all churches are dying. There are churches that have plenty of people in attendance. And they're not the churches that are more radical and modern. I attended Mass with a friend in a small village in the middle of nowhere, and it was a thriving church. No struggling to fill the church and half the people in there will be dead in 20 years. Oh, not for that church. It was packed. And it was the most evangelical, happy-clappy church I've ever been to. Because the church isn't a pub or a nightclub. A lot of people who go to church tend to hold on to tradition. I'd say go to a lot of Church of England cathedrals in particular, and you see a love of ritual. High churches, you see a obsession, not meant in a bad way, with incense and Latin. There seems to be a love of ritual, which frankly comes through more than a love of God or doctrinal belief. Churches are at a crossroads. They have to decide, and I'm talking major established churches, they have to decide whether they want to maintain tradition, whether they want to be representatives of eternal truths, or whether they want to be the cool kids who tell you that whatever modern society tells you okay is okay. The leadership of the Church of England seems to be very woke, and whilst Welby was very well-meaning, I'm sure, I see no candidates to replace him who aren't at least as woke. It seems like they're subtly having a discussion in the background about who's more woke. I don't know that much about the Church of England, but my money would be on a female lesbian bishop if they can push one forward. We'll see how that goes down with the Anglican Communion globally. And the Catholic Church. It seems that whilst on his seeming deathbed, Pope Francis has been able to do some work, and he's managed to get some cardinals to come to Rome for an extraordinary meeting, and he's been able to reorganise the Diocese of Brazil. This is the country where he allowed a separate rite. So whilst Amazonian churches are allowed to worship a native figure, an ancient goddess refigured as a form of Mary, he discourages the use of Latin in masses. Quite frankly, if Pope Francis is adding cardinals, he's doing it to get the right cardinals. We have a big fuss in the US when they put people on the Supreme Court that they're stacking the court in favour of Democrats or Republicans. Well, the same thing happens with archbishops and cardinals. And it feels like both churches are setting up for a more secular future. Secularism is the death of the church. If you don't believe in church dogma, if you don't believe in what the church says, if you don't even believe, well, it's the right thing, but I'm not going to do it, or it's the ideal, but I'll do something slightly different. If you don't really believe in it, why bother go to church? Why bother give them any money? And both institutions have a lot of money, let's face it. I think there's interesting questions with the Catholic Church over what they've been doing in China, because they've effectively agreed to bishops being appointed by the Chinese government. Now, why did they do that? Money. Why does it matter which path the church chooses? Well, let's leave Christianity all behind. Think of Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, a good man, a man with a moral compass, with ethics, with thought and intellect. Whenever I heard him, I heard an opinion I would respect, an alternative view. And with the speed of the modern world, we need the alternative view of tradition. And like it or lump it, the churches and religion as a whole are the voice of that tradition. And it's a tradition we are marching away from at breakneck speed. There's always a politician who's willing to change anything. But it takes a moral philosopher like Rabbi Sacks to raise interesting questions. Which archbishop or pope the two churches pick won't affect my choice of church, won't affect whether I go to a church, won't affect whether I sit and think when I do. But it can rob society of that moral compass. Instead of a moral compass, we just get a confirmation of what society thinks anyway. And if we look at what are being touted as the top 5 contenders for Pope, Louis Antonio Tagle, he's described as progressive and compassionate. I'll be frank, I describe him as a left-wing radical who's got very close links to left-wing elements in that country. Wim Ike from the Netherlands, staunch conservative. I'm sure I won't agree with a lot of what he says, but at least I'd respect it. Friedhelm Ambongo Besongo from the Congo, a conservative African voice. That's going to be a hard sell in a lot of the Western world. Peter Turkson from Ghana advocates for social justice and economic equality. Well, we all know that that is political. And as I've said before, I don't like my priests to be political. And Pietro Parolin, a Vatican diplomat, a moderate choice who represents continuity with Pope Francis's leadership. Well, I'm already lost on that one. So whilst I look to churches to give tradition and continuity of moral philosophy, I don't feel like either church has much hope of offering it. And without that continuity, without that tradition, they will be empty. I'm reminded of The Godfather Part 3, where Cardinal Lamberto, sitting next to the fountain, says, "Look at this stone. It's been lying in the water for a very long time, but the water has not penetrated it." He breaks it open, and he says, "Look, perfectly dry. The same thing has happened in Europe. For centuries, men have been surrounded by Christianity, but Christ has not penetrated. Christ doesn't live within them." Well, this is actually a quote by Pope John Paul I, taken from David Yallop's book In God's Name, which Godfather Part 3 is basically stolen as its plotline. 2025 seems like the year that the Catholic Church and the Anglican Church drain that fountain.